Hi, everyone. Happy Monday. Welcome back. I wanted to take our mini lesson time today to talk about two sort of intersecting motifs that I see in Beloved. I told you to keep an eye out last week, so hopefully you saw these popping up through the reading. If you didn't, definitely keep an eye this week as you're doing your reading assignment. Okay. So to start off, let's go to the dictionary. Let's look at this word consume a little bit more because like possession from last week, it has some very different meanings and different connotations that I think are worth unpacking. Okay, so the most common definition for consume is to eat, drink, ingest, or absorb, right? Consumed an apple, something that you eat, something you drink, right? Pretty straightforward. Another definition we might think about is the use of a finite resource, right? Here in my example sentence, fossil fuels are being consumed rapidly. Similar to the first definition, but with this sense of scarcity, okay? And then finally, and I think perhaps most interesting to me in general, is this idea of obsession, right? The idea that someone might be consumed by something, that it becomes such a big part of their lives that they themselves are maybe ingested or owned or possessed, right? And it's with this last definition that I want to kind of circle back to last week to make a connection to the idea of ownership or belonging, right? In a way, I think that consumption involves a sense of implied ownership. In other words, to consume something is to claim ownership of it. If we even think of just like the definition of consume as like to eat, right? If you consume an apple, you are incorporating that thing into your body. And what could be a clearer sign of possession than incorporating something into your body? The other sort of thing that I can't believe I forgot to talk about this with possession last week is that when we're thinking about a ghost story, when we're thinking about haunting, this other kind of possession is the sort of religious sense that someone might be possessed by an evil spirit. I think that that's not exactly what's happening in Beloved, but it's parallel enough that it's worth noting. How does this relate to consumption? Well, we might say that in the situation of a demonic possession, a body is being consumed by evil or evil forces or something like that, maybe. Cool. Now, to circle back to the most common definition of consumption, we see a lot of eating and drinking throughout Beloved. If we think back to Cathedral, this short story by Raymond Carver that we read in our very first unit of the year, we'll recall this very like gluttonous meal, this vivid description of the meal that Robert, the blind man, and the narrator and his wife sit down to eat together. It's almost a gluttonous portrayal of consumption. And we talked about this at the time, but as a reminder, whenever we see food or meals in fiction, in storytelling, it's never just a meal. Most often, almost always, it's some kind of communion, some kind of coming together. And this is part of the human condition, right? Like across cultures, food often means congregating, means connecting with people, okay? We see a couple of really important meals in Beloved. I'm just going to highlight a few. When Paul D first arrives at 124, we see Setha cook him a meal, making bread from scratch and then also incorporating leftovers from her job. So this kind of patchwork meal that celebrates the connection of Paul D with the people at 124. One that we saw in last week's reading that is super important is Baby Suggs' first meal as a free person, right? We'll remember it's just warm milk and I think cornbread, which is very bare bones. She's connecting with these abolitionists, the Bodwins, and their house servant, Janie. She is finding her new home, her new community. This meal is very important as well. But perhaps the most memorable meal from the entire novel is this one that precedes the misery, the event in which Setha attempts to kill all four of her children, right? Well, remember that this meal has some really significant and even unanticipated consequences, right? It's this big coming together of people to eat in excess. It's a celebratory event of all of these Black folks from this area of Cincinnati coming together to eat too much, to play, to enjoy one another's company. But interestingly, in sort of in a way that seems like a contradiction, it creates this sense of spite, of a collective sense of, I won't say envy, but a sense that Baby Suggs is living beyond her means in a way that is flashy and impolite, right? We'll remember that in the Southern Gothic as a genre as well, the sort of collective sentiment of a town, the gossip of a town has its own sort of character and prominence in the narrative. So this kind of fits in with the genre. Importantly, the narration of the book suggests that that sense of spite is the reason that no one alerts Setha and her family when they see the slave catchers come to town. So in kind of an indirect way, this feast results in the tragic events around which this story orbits. Okay. So I want to sort of theorize about this hunger and thirst a little bit. Hunger is a desire to eat. Thirst is a desire to drink. We might expand a little bit further to even say that this desire to consume, to eat or drink or take in somehow, is magnified or complemented by absence, right? So when you have a desire to eat and no food, that creates a craving, right? We remember from our first week that absence is this common motif throughout the book. So I want to tie it to craving. Wanting something suggests that you don't have that thing. Okay. Now I want to contextualize this a little bit as well. We might think about this psychologically. Freud would say that hunger is part of our id. Our desires and urges to consume are part of this very base level of our psychology. If we think about it neurologically, we can trace hunger to the hypothalamus, which is this teeny little part of the limbic system. The limbic system is the most sort of like instinctive, animalistic part of our brains. So we have in both neurology and psychology this idea of craving as something that is before humanity, before the human part of our brain, before this part of us that's responsible for complex thinking or decision making. Hunger and thirst and desire come from this part of us that is so deep that it is unfiltered by our beliefs in morality. Okay. I know that's a lot to throw at you, but just to kind of theorize about this a little bit. We have several important cravings in the story of Beloved. One that a lot of you have drawn attention to is how Beloved, this corporeal embodiment of the ghost, craves sweets all the time. One really easy explanation for this is that because Beloved was killed as a child, her reincarnation is still very childish, right? Children love sweet things, right? So I think that's one way to go with it. I think there are other interpretive paths that we could take with it as well. We also see Baby Suggs' craving for color. Some of you pointed out insightfully that desire, that craving to see color suggests that life is dreary and gray. I think that we see some of that kind of imagery in the novel as well, but we can't forget either that color is the main axis along which race is defined. Slavery relies on the idea of race to justify itself. So when we see a craving for color, we can't neglect that color is such an important part of maintaining slavery and racism. Okay. We see craving for companionship as well, right? Denver, this deeply isolated, lonely character, describes herself as starving for companionship when the baby ghost is driven away by Paul D. Throughout the novel, she is craving someone to be with her and to share with her in her life. which is one of the reasons that she is so enthusiastic about Beloved, the human form. But I think maybe the most fascinating and important craving that we witness in Beloved is stories, the craving for story. We see this mostly with Beloved, but really from all the characters. And I see this as working in a number of ways. A craving for story suggests a desire for knowledge, of memory. We've talked about how important memory is in this book. So when we think about craving knowledge of the past in the form of a story, we're talking about filling in gaps and understanding causality as it has led us from one point to another. Okay. Stories are also a way that people connect in a really deep way. It's intimate, and it has a teller as well as a listener. And that sort of connection, that transaction, I think is really important. Finally, stories are the main way that we define and identify ourselves, okay? You've probably heard the expression that like each of our identities is a collection of all the stories that we tell about ourselves. That idea has some really important resonances with what we talked about last week in terms of owning oneself, claiming one's body as one's own. If your identity is based on the stories you tell about yourself, then your identity is also determined by who is allowed to tell that story, who it is that narrates the stories of who you are. All right, that's a good place for us to turn to the text. I wanted to turn to a page from Beloved. This is page 83 in my edition. If you would, please pause and reread this page so we can talk about how consumption and memory intersect. Okay, you'll notice a handful of things about this passage. The first one is this really clear connection of hunger and memory. Right? Setha is talking about how her brain is like a greedy child. She wishes that it would just say, I'm full, I don't want any more, but how without any restraint, almost in an animalistic way, away from this like deep animal part of our brains, it is just scooping up more and more memory, even when she doesn't want it. This is the scene, of course, where Paul D has just told her about Hallie in the loft, and she is trying to reject that information, but her brain is too hungry to deny it. Notably, this has kind of the opposite effect on her sense of the future, okay? So her brain is so active, consuming the past, snatching up every little bit like a greedy child, that she doesn't have the capacity to imagine the future. Her brain was not interested in the future. It was loaded with the past and hungry for more. No room to imagine or let alone plan for the next day. I want to highlight this because I think it can teach us something about systems of oppression. Okay, so systems of oppression have major impacts on people's physical bodies. They harm them with violence. They restrict them in their movements. But in a more abstract and fascinating way, systems of oppression also constrict someone's sense of futurity, their ability to aspire to certain dreams, their capacity to think about investing in the future rather than just getting by day to day. We can think about this maybe even in the context of like poverty, right? Someone who is experiencing poverty is going to be more focused on, they're going to use more brain space on where their next meal is coming from, whether they're going to be able to pay their bills, pay rent this month, so immediate that they can't necessarily save money for the future or plan for the future, right? That is a privilege created by systems of oppression. This idea is really emphasized in Beloved in terms of the past and trauma, okay? If we have unresolved trauma from the past, it makes it impossible for someone to think beyond even the present day, to think about where they might go, what they might aspire to be. That idea is, of course, echoed by Paul D when he is recalling his experience in the prison camp, and as well by Denver when she refers to the baby dress apparition as having plans. Okay. So what we're noticing is that attention to this motif of consumption, especially when we incorporate cravings like hunger and thirst, attention to this motif helps us identify some really complex insights about the novel and the story it tells, as well as the society on which it's commenting. Now, I had you try to attend to one other motif this past week, and I think we see the motif of craving intersect with that of watching or looking in a really beautiful way right at the beginning of chapter 12. So what I'd like you to do is pause for a second. You can either go to your book and read the first few pages of chapter 12. If nothing else, please just pause for a moment here and read the passage that I've got on the screen. Okay. So what you're probably seeing here is that we are conflating now hunger and looking. Denver takes this joy, this pleasure, this sort of like satiating pleasure in watching Beloved, but even more so being watched by Beloved. This idea of seeing and being seen is fascinating because it seems to suggest to us that watching or looking, in this instance at least, is a form of consuming, right? Of a hunger to be seen or a hunger to watch being satisfied by watching or looking. Okay. I see this play out in a really fascinating way with kind of two prongs. One of them is the idea here of spectacle. So you're probably familiar with this word. Typically, it means sort of like taking some kind of pleasure in the act of watching. It's often like a community event where there are a lot of people who are watching. We see this in the book, most obviously, say like at the carnival, right? This group of Black folks who are congregating to take pleasure in the watching of white people in this, what they would call at the time a quote unquote freak show, right? We also see spectacle when Sethe is describing the first time she has sex with Hallie, right? The two of them think they're going into a private place, the cornfield, to have sex for the first time. But as we sort of zoom out, we see the other slaves watching the tops of the corn stalks swaying and kind of giving away what those two are doing. So if we think about that, then this idea of spectacle also really blurs the lines of public and private, kind of opens up that binary the way this novel opens up a lot of binaries to a liminal space. Now, finally, and this is a little bit more complex, I want to define the misery, this act where Sethe tries to kill all four of her children as a moment of spectacle, right? Now, I don't mean this in the same way as the carnival, right? Taking pleasure, but maybe in the same way as people who would see a car accident, something that is like very visually impactful that you can't help but look at. This idea that Sethe murdering her one child and attempting to murder all four of them becomes spectacular when it becomes broadcast across abolitionist media. It also becomes spectacular in commentary on slavery. Okay, what I mean by this is that violence in the era of slavery was as much about punishing one slave as it was about scaring other slaves. And for that reason, a lot of the violence of slavery was highly visible, especially to the people who would have that violence enacted against themselves. So the idea of spectacle is one that is of concern to the narrative, but also illustrates a lot about the conditions of violence within slavery. The other facet of watching or looking as a form of consumption that I think is really notable is the idea of witness, which in a lot of ways is opposite to the idea of spectacle. Witnessing something still has this element of watching, of seeing, of observing, But rather than being a pleasurable experience in which a lot of people engage, it's maybe something that one or only a few people see. And with that constraint, that person or those few people are the only ones who can, quote, testify to the truth, who can use what they have seen to create a story of what is true. Which is, of course, really important when we come back to the idea of memory or trauma. When we remember that this is ultimately, this book is a memorial, right? And to memorialize in a way is to bear witness. This concern with watching and looking becomes really important on a literary front when we come back to this literary term that I've been harping on all year long, focalization. Okay, well, recall that this has to do with third-person narration, and it refers to the perspective through which that narration is filtered. We might say, in other words, it is the nature of how we as readers are watching or consuming the story to contextualize within this lesson. Okay, this perspective through which a story is focalized determines how we watch, how we consume, and what exactly it is that we are watching and consuming. We'll remember that even though third-person narration often acts as objective, that this process of focalization will often distort or influence the way a story is told or what is included in that story. This idea becomes especially important and especially troubling when we turn to chapter 16. I'm referring to this event as the Misery, this event where Sethe attempts to murder her 4 children, successfully killing Beloved. In chapter 16, the first time we actually look directly at this event, it is focalized through the perspective of the slave catchers, not through Sethe's perspective, not through Baby Suggs' perspective, not through Stamp's perspective. All 3 of them are there. It's their story, but it is being told as if we are on the side of the slave catchers. This raises a lot of really important and complicated questions. The first one being, obviously, what does it mean that this event that inspired the novel, this event around which the entire narrative revolves, is told through the eyes of a slave catcher? What does that mean? Why, this is like really the only perspective from white people that we get in the entire book, and it is this main tragic event. Okay, I think it raises a couple of points, right? We see one moment in this chapter, this quote, "There was nothing to claim." Okay, it reminds us that in this era, Sethe and her children are not seen as people; they are seen as property. This actually becomes one of the most important linchpins of the real-life Margaret Garner's court case. After she murdered one of her children, they could not decide whether to try her as a person for murder or to consider her property and send her back to the South without any criminal charges. Okay, so we are reminded through this focalization that these people responsible for tragedy and death see Sethe and her family only as property. Okay. We also see this repeated line from the nephew, what you want to go and do that for, insisting upon itself with its repetition, which is a dark reminder that the white people, particularly slave owners of this era, could not comprehend, literally could not imagine how oppressive, how dehumanizing, how troubling slavery actually was. We see this nephew comparing the way that his brother brutally beat Sethe after they sexually assaulted her to a whipping that he got as a child. Okay, and the fact that he cannot understand why Sethe would rather see her children dead than to go back into slavery, he's asking what you want to go and do that for. This narrative choice to focalize this chapter through the perspective of the slave catchers also reminds us of a really important truth, that power belongs to the person telling the story. They have control over what details to include, what background to include. They have the choice over how to portray events, and what moral, ultimately, the listener draws from the story. So even though we have this book, which is about remembering, think back to that first lecture, remembering the past and bringing together the experience of Black folks under slavery, the moment on which all of this is based is ultimately told from the perspective of slave owners. To situate all of this looking and craving and desire within the larger world, we might also say that humans crave story, right? Just like Beloved, this non-human sort of supernatural being, we all crave story too, because it allows us to make sense of ourselves, our identities, and the world around us, to better understand where we came from and where we are going next. We require story to do that, narrative. We might call it history or we might call it science, but ultimately it's all just stories that sustain our vision of who we are. Okay. So I'll leave you with these couple of questions. Okay. Specifically to American history and Beloved, we have this question of who bears witness to the history of slavery, who has seen slavery in a way that they can testify to its truth. And secondly, more generally, on a human level, how do we consume stories? And how do those stories in turn consume us? Okay. Think about it. Enjoy your reading this week. Please reach out if there's anything that I can do to support you. I'm hoping you're all doing well, and I look forward to talking this Friday. Be in touch.